بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ومولانا وحبيبنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. So as you and those of you who are on the live know, we have been covering a really important text that's called The Foundations of the Spiritual Path by Sidi Ahmad Zarruq, and I think this is maybe our 8th session or 9th session. So we've gone through a lot of this text already, but alhamdulillah, we're kind of nearing the end of it. And last month we left off on the section that was really talking about sinfulness and what happens when we are, negligent and we start to fall into these pitfalls. Basically, when we're not really taking care of our, spiritual heart, we're more susceptible to spiritual disease, and those diseases take on a certain form, right? So Sidi Ahmad Zarruq says that there are 3 things that if we do them, they're going to lead to further afflictions of the heart. And so he says complacency, so basically just getting really stagnant. Our spiritual path should be kind of like a staircase, where we're gonna, we grow. We hopefully this is the way that it's going. Just like we develop as human beings and we grow, right? Physically, emotionally, we mature. There should be a spiritual maturity, and so anytime you get to a place of the spiritual heart, there's something wrong, right? Because the believer, no matter where you're at, you should always seek to be better. Right? But when you get to a place where it's like, I'm neutral, I'm numb, and this is the part of the modern world, this is what they really try to teach or what they're indoctrinating us from a very young age with are these ideas that nothing matters, right? There's no meaning to anything. So people become very numb. And that numbness is a sign of serious spiritual disease. So he's saying if you have that problem, or the opposite, which is you're persistently sinning, you're not making tawbah, you're not stopping your sinfulness, you're just continuously sinning. This is another very serious sign of real problems that are going to come in different forms. And that's what we covered last week and where we'll pick up the conversation today. So he's identifying these 3 behaviors: complacency, persistent sin, and negligence of Allah in solitude. So when you're by yourself, this is also an opportunity for your true self to emerge. It's understandable to a certain degree if you think about like social pressure. We live in a time where people are they don't want to be judged by other people, so maybe they're in a way minimizing their faith around other people, right? Maybe they're not as proud of their faith at the workspace, for example, or in school. And this is, to a certain degree, we can say understandable. But what excuse does a person have when they are completely by themselves? There's nobody looking at you. There's nobody judging you. There's no one there to be afraid of necessarily. Then how can you explain your negligence to Allah, right? That means clearly the faith is very weak. So if he's saying if these things are in a person's heart, they are the roots of all of our problems. All of the faults that we have are these 3 things. You're either complacent, you're not growing, you're kind of fine where you are, you don't have a desire to grow, you're persistently sinning, or when you're with no one, when you're by yourself and it's just you and Allah, you're still negligent. If you have any of these 3, or God forbid, somehow a combination of all of these 3, that is a clear sign that you are opening the doors of calamities, of actual ibtilat, tribulations upon you, and you're going to acquire a lot of spiritual diseases. So he says, by having these qualities, you're basically going to prefer ignorance over knowledge. You're going to be easily manipulated by spiritual charlatans, right? People who say a lot of things that are not true. And, there's a lot of people who make claims. They manipulate people all the time, ask them for money. Someone recently told me about, they went to someone to find out if they had sihr on them. And sihr is like black magic, as we know, right? this is a big fear in this day and age. There's a lot of people who worry that, oh, certain things aren't going for me. I'm not getting married. I'm not getting a job. I don't have, I've had bad luck, right? And so in the modern age, the mind goes to trying to figure out the source and assuming oftentimes that there must be someone who is out to get me, who doesn't like me, who doesn't like my family. Maybe it's someone back home. Maybe it's someone, a relative or someone from your past. But the mind will come up with all these scenarios and explanations of why a person may not have khair in their life. And what that does is they open themselves then to these charlatans, these people who will tell you, I can figure out if you have, any type of magic done on you, but you have to pay me money, you have to do this, you have to do that. So you just start to become less, protected from these evil forces. Because, first of all, if you're not seeking knowledge, then you wouldn't know how to distinguish, right, between someone who's truthful and someone who is a liar. You don't know the signs. And that's what he's really explaining in this text. He goes through what the signs are of a true spiritual guide versus someone who's just trying to make money or just tricking people, right? But a lot of people, they don't realize that in order to even know how to distinguish between the two, that requires a degree of knowledge. It requires something, right? And so what he's saying is if you're complacent, you're persisting in sin, and you're negligent of Allah, then you are going to open the door to all of these problems. Number one, you're going to be more drawn to ignorance than knowledge, right? Number two, you're going to be tricked by spiritual charlatans. You're going to be neglectful of important matters, like your duties, And there are people who, it's amazing. They take their work, for example, very seriously, because it's like, I have to pay the bills. They like their lifestyles. They like the wealth, and they may take that very seriously, but then they're very negligent about taking care of their parents, And our Sharia is very clear on, there's an order to what's important. But what happens is, again, if you're not practicing your faith, it all gets jumbled up. And so you start to let your desires dictate for you. You start to let the dunya dictate for you. And in your mind, maybe you think it's important. I'm working, I'm fulfilling my responsibility. But if it means at the same time that you're working, you're neglectful of your loved ones, right? You're neglectful. That's a problem. And some people, it's not by choice, I'm talking about people who choose. They choose to ignore their elderly parents. They don't visit them. They don't take care of their needs, but they're vacationing. They're traveling the world. They're going to fine dining experiences, they're buying fancy cars and brand names, but their other family members are neglected. Or there's a phenomenon that I'm sure we all know, an example of people who've divorced. And during the process of divorce, what happens? One person just disappears. They call the fathers the deadbeat dads, right? But I'm sure there are women who do the same thing. They just disappear. They neglect their duties to their children. So, astaghfirullah, these are the things that you open yourself up to, that you're just completely become neglectful. And then on top of that, obviously your worship, you're not even praying, right? When you're falling into this degree of sinfulness, you're not praying. You're likely not going to fast in Ramadan. You're likely not going to give zakah. So basically, you have opened upon yourself through this negligence you've acquired so much, so many sins and poor character that it's just kind of like, feeds itself. And that's what happens to people. That's what misguidance is, right? It's like one in the lizard hole, right? Which is just, a metaphor for basically falling behind those who are already kind of doomed. And you see that in the way people dress. You see that in the culture that they, acquire, or that they, take on through music and through other things. It's like, subhanAllah. So we're just going to imitate people, that are low quality, low character people. The way that we speak, there are people in our community who don't use proper language anymore. They curse. They're very foul in their language. So these are all signs of real, serious problems and misguidance. Behaving capriciously in both trivial and weighty matters. So basically, again, because you're not a serious person, you're not a person of substance, of taqwa, of really mindfulness, of knowing your place in the world, knowing your relationship with Allah, you become this, person that's just weightless, and being a capricious person is like you're trivial, you're silly. There's, you're letting your hawa, your whims and desires control you in everything, whether it's serious or not. It doesn't matter, because there's no thought, there's no contemplation, there's no will this please Allah, is this good for my akhirah. The believer is always weighing decisions, is always weighing words, is always weighing choices based on a standard, a standard that is informed by their faith. But when you're not a person that takes your faith seriously, then, like many people, and we have a very serious problem if we look at the culture around us, of people who just don't live with meaning and purpose. They're living for desire, they're living for fun and entertainment, they're living to consume themselves. I mean, some people quite literally are consuming themselves to death, right? Feeding their physical bodies, feeding their sexual desires, feeding their egos. So you just become a person that's not doing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended for you to do, which is to worship Him and find, meaning through that worship, which sustains us. When you live a life of meaning, you can get by in this dunya, because it's the very, practice of your faith that's helping you deal with all the insanity in the world. Like, I mean, sometimes I marvel at how people exist in this world without faith. I really don't know how they do it. It doesn't make any sense to me, right? Because it's like, subhanAllah, how do you deal with all the evil? How do you make sense of just alone, the genocide alone right now, because that's the most obvious sign of evil. But then you have all the trafficking of innocent children, the harm to just so many people. Like, how can you make sense of it if you don't believe in the Day of Judgment? Wallahi, I don't know, right? It's amazing. It's terrifying. Exactly. No, you're right. I think about that too. Like, yeah, what is preventing people from acting on their evil more if they don't believe that there's consequences to their actions, right? We have a mental health crisis because a lot of people may wonder, like, why do we have all these mental health problems? Well, all of this leads to spiritual disease that leads to the whole body almost in a way becoming burdened because of this ignorance. So the next thing he talks about is having obsessive compulsive thoughts. In their boundaries, the lion is a lion, the dog is a dog, the rabbit is a rabbit. They're in fitra. There's a level of predictability to their behavior, instinct, that we can predict. But the human being without God is very dangerous, because we have the intellectual capacity to do a lot more outside of fitra, right? Our fitra is to worship God. Our fitra is to be good and pure, but we can easily stray from that when we don't have something to rein in, right? That nafs al-amara bisu. And that's why mujahid al-nafs is very real. The idea that, yeah, you are expected to struggle every day. It's just because you become a Muslim or a believer, it doesn't mean you have an easy ride. Faith is a gift from Allah, but it's the beginning of a journey of struggle, because you have oppositional forces within you. You have the force that wants Allah, that yearns to be to go to its final abode with the Creator. That's part of you. But then you also have an animal aspect, a low aspect of you that calls you to sinfulness and forgetfulness. And these two forces are fighting. And the way to protect yourself is to have order, right? So if you don't pray, what's going to happen to you, right? Who's going to win, right? Between these two forces, the one that wants God and the one that wants to forget God, who is going to win if you're not praying? Who's going to win if you're not even, maintaining wudu? I mean, just thinking about what a blessing wudu is, right? And for those of us who wear hijab, even our hijab, when you think about wudu, it's a personal, action that we do that reminds us that we have to enter a state of purity to convene and with God, right? Because we talk to people all the time, we socialize, we're always, chatting it up with this person or that person. But I love that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you wish to engage me, whether it's reading his book or praying to him, that you need to enter a state of purity first, because the impurity is a reminder that we. So it's all right to stay within the boundaries, because we're suddenly like, oh yeah, and they see me, and I better, behave, and that's I think a really great blessing to, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I think expects us to show our faith to some degree. For the brothers, I think it's really important that they wear something, or like whether it's a kufi or have a beard. It's the same idea. Like, show your presence, but also benefit from the reminders of just having people looking at you and holding you to account, right? Holding you accountable to be a representative of your faith. And that'll make your practice of faith a lot easier. So these are all great blessings that I think we take for granted. But again, if you're not mindful, then you're just going to waste your time watching TV. You're going to waste your time eating. You're going to waste your time playing video games. You're going to waste your time, going shopping and just consuming and acquiring wealth that you don't even know what to do with. We have garages that are bursting. We have storage containers. People have so many things, they have to buy storage space. What are we doing with all this? It's just because we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. Now, the other things he mentions, which are also important, because what I like what he does is he's giving us a picture of, not this black and white scenario where either you're misguided or you're guided, right? What he's describing is those people that kind of fall in the gray, where you have a Muslim identity, but you're not really on the path properly. And so you're susceptible to all these diseases, but you're not even aware. And I think when we talk about, you mentioned the nafs al-ammara bisu, but there's 3 nufus, right, that the Quran talks about. And I think there's more, but the 3 main ones are nafs al-ammara bisu, which is the one that's the lowest, and we ask Allah always to protect us from that. Then nafs al-lawama, right, which is the self-reproaching soul, right, the one that's always in this back and forth struggle. And then inshallah, the nafs al-mutma'inna. This is the one that we all want to be. But I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of Muslims who identify as Muslim believers, who really do believe, and inshallah in the next week or so we're going to see, our community come out, in ways, and it's a beautiful thing to see. Alhamdulillah, Allahumma balighna Ramadan, that we all get an opportunity to welcome the month. But I think we'll see this, many people who come to, or who are showing their practice of faith, that maybe we don't see all the time. But I would say the vast majority of believers probably fall into that middle state, right? That the nafs al-lawama, which is what the soul that's constantly back and forth, back and forth. And the descriptions he's giving is really for us, right? Like these things that he's describing are for those of us who are that they're blind spots. We're not paying attention that these are all symptoms. These behaviors that he's describing are symptoms of spiritual disease that you want to be careful of. So when he says, if you're having obsessive compulsive thoughts, if you're overindulging in normal human activities, in other words, you're not balanced, right? Balance is the key. Then he says, gathering ritually for invocation and chanting. Now someone would say, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with gathering for, dua and dhikr, or some sort of, like we have, different gatherings where people come together and do anshad and things like, what's wrong with that? Isn't that a good sign? But if you think about it, if you're doing all of those things, but you're not on top of the things that are important, yeah, the core ones, that's a problem, isn't it? Like if you're attending dhikr, but then you're not praying your 5 daily prayers, and believe it or not, that's happening in our community. There are people who really like to attend fun Islamic events, events that are more, they have an entertainment value, or there's a social value. I come and I get to see my friends, I get to have fun. Now, maybe it's a religious gathering, but if you're doing that consistently, regularly, don't be deluded, in other words, to think that you are, on the right path, especially if you're not praying, if you're not doing your fara'id, you're not doing the things that Allah expects of you. This is how the nafs gets deluded. And we're very susceptible to delusion of the nafs when we count, when we have when we don't know how to value things, properly. A good analogy would be like, like someone who appraises, if you want jewelry to be appraised, you go to an expert, right? You go to a jewelry, maker, someone, and or someone who sells gold or diamonds, and you give them your jewelry, and they, because they know what's quality, what's not, will give you the value. But if you go to a baker, or someone else who's I don't know, a gardener, someone who's not in the realm of jewelry, has no idea how to value, know if a diamond is real, if gold is fake, and you ask them to value what your, items are, you're likely not going to get a very accurate, right, value. And I think that's what happens to people who, they don't follow the standard of the Prophet ﷺ, the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. They don't follow the guidance as it's given to us, and they kind of start to trust themselves, and then one thing leads to another, and that's why all of these things kind of get out of control. We become scattered, we become very just inconsistent. And so, yeah, a person, you're attending all of these events, and maybe you're thinking, wow, I'm attending religious events, but you're not in a good place. In other words, be careful. These are serious signs of problems. The next one is also very important, because I think in the day and age of social media, this is so relevant. Drawing attention to oneself at every opportunity. This is a day and age of attention seeking, and a lot of people want to be seen. But that is something that we should be very wary of, because it speaks of serious spiritual diseases. We shouldn't want people to know about our every accomplishment, our every, source of pride. We shouldn't, whatever it is, but to seek, whether it's visually to be seen, or people to know about you, what you're doing, where your family is going, whatever. People now, they just put everything out in the space of social media anyway, advertising everything and anything. But that is a real clear sign of spiritual disease, right? So making sure that you're aware of that, and not to fall into, well, it's just, what's the big deal? It's just Instagram. What's the big deal? It's just TikTok. What's the big deal? I'm just, sharing my anniversary pictures, or my, wedding, or whatever it is. No, it is. We should be very careful not to broadcast our lives and feel the need to. And even in our clothing, like, I don't know, I just find it very strange that we live in a day and age of brand names, and people making such a big deal about that, Is it Aisha? It's early, isn't it? Okay, mashallah. So they are praying right now. Okay. If you wanted to join, you can. Or we can also finish. I'm sorry? Yeah, maybe if you don't mind, because I thought they pray at 8. Yeah, mashallah. Oh, perhaps they're just practicing Quran. What we permit, because, it's like, oh, we don't want to push our kids away. So there's a lot of justification that's happening with the Muslim community, I think, in the West around these topics, because it's like, well, what do you expect? Like you said, they're in public school, this is their culture everywhere you go. But I think part of, our faith requires us, the boundaries of Sharia are so clear, and we have to respect them, and there's no exemption. There's no exception to the rule. When we make exceptions to the rule, this is where we're slipping. And because the nafs will try to logic its way into sinfulness, like we'll try to justify it through these logic games, but if we do this, then that will happen. Exactly. Exactly. And it's all nafs, and it's all iblis. He knows that, because they want to infiltrate. It's like, again, Sharia, if you think of it like a fence or a boundary, it's very solid. But if we allow like the gate to open a little bit here and there and here, then, the enemies start to come in, and we only have ourselves to blame. But if we have vigilance, and we're making sure that the fence, or the barrier and the boundary is very solid, then we protect, right, for ourselves and our hearts from the infiltration. So, making, these connections with our behavior and the fact that they're all indications of spiritual disease is what he's trying to do. Like, don't be deluded that just because you do certain things that you're okay, because in the grand scheme of things, it's very clear what your purpose is. Worship God, right? There, I mean, it's all laid out for you. And so once you start to play with these ideas and then thinking that, you know, like like you're doing certain things over others, you're now just again deluded by your nafs, and you're on a very dangerous path. So he actually goes into some more descriptions, which I think I can, yeah, I'll read this because it's very helpful to give more insight into what he's speaking about when he talks specifically about certain things. For example, the obsessive compulsive thoughts, right? How does one protect oneself from those things? He says they actually come from innovation, the basis of which is ignorance of the Sunnah or some psychological affliction. So there's two ways that a person can be afflicted with like obsessive compulsive thoughts. When it comes to your worship, it's likely because you don't know the Sunnah, right? For example, you know, the Prophet ﷺ did things a certain way. If you're in wudu and you know that his Sunnah was to do things 3 times, khalas, you commit to the Sunnah. But if you're not really clear about the fiqh of wudu, the way the Prophet ﷺ did it, you're not reading those descriptions, then in your mind, you may think 5 times will be better, you know, 6 times will be better. And so you start to introduce the bid'ah, and then that's how you become now obsessive, right? And I know people who, this is what happened to them. They start to come up with their own ideas. You know, they don't leave the house unless, you know, they have to go unlock the door, lock the door 3 times, 4 times, or they say certain du'as. I mean, I knew someone close to me who, she was very afflicted by OCD, where she couldn't even leave the house without doing these things that were outside of the Sunnah. It was nothing in the Sunnah, it was just something. OCD. People are given the impression that, oh, they're weak spiritually, and that's why they have that. But we don't accept that always. You know, that everybody's different. Some people could very well have a chemical imbalance, could have something else. So I love that he put that there to validate that there's different experiences. But he's just mentioning that if you're doing this a lot with your spiritual worship, it might be because you have allowed bid'ah to be introduced to into your own practice. You just need to go back to the Sunnah and follow the Sunnah, right? And then he says, as for those overindulging in worldly matters, had they realized, they would know that worldly engagements are a dispensation due to human frailties and should be limited to the necessities of life, nothing more. You know, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us time to enjoy dunya, but it's not in lieu of obligation, right? You have to be fulfilling your obligation, you have to really be ahead and working towards spiritual goals, and then whatever extra time you have, you can enjoy. But we're in a world where everything is inverted now. Everybody has a lot of time for entertainment, a lot of time for enjoyment and fun, and then we squeeze in little time for spiritual practice. This is the problem, right? That it's all upside down. Indeed, they are actually remedies. They are actually remedies and are a way of fulfilling the right of divine wisdom in such affairs. No one is unrestrained in worldly pursuits unless he or she is far from Allah. So when we become very indulgent in our desires and dunya, wanting dunya, it's actually a sign that we're distant from Allah. Because the believer who's close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't, you rebuke the dunya. You see the dunya as being a source of distraction from God, right? So, and a practical way of explaining that is, you know, just all of the things that people get caught up in, as we said, music, television, film, entertainment, constantly going out, socializing, idle talk, overconsumption, shopping, you know, all those things that are very normalized in this consumer culture. If you're doing all of those things, how do you have time to worship God, right? If you're going to go to the theaters, you're going to go to concerts, you're going to party, you're going to eat constantly, how will you have any time to worship Allah? So that's why the believer who's on the path understands that I limit my time for those things, and I do them because Allah permits me whatever's halal, but for the majority of my life, I want to be doing serious things, you know, that... Hmm? Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Well, that's the thing is that our deen, again, it makes that so clear that really there's no excuse other than you've just given in to your desire. Because if you understood how important it is to have that prioritization, right? I mean, everything. Constantly we're told in the Quran, we're constantly redirected, to remember Allah, to remember death, to take care of our debts, to make sure that we're serving the poor and the needy and our families. I mean, how many reminders over and over again does Allah give us? And looking at the Prophet ﷺ's life, right? So there's just ample proof that there is an order of what's important. And if you're not following that, it's